Welcome to this edition of Safe and Sound. I am your host, Kirk Webb, sponsored by White Mountain Fire and Life Safety. On this edition, we have Chief Jim Morgan of Pine Top Fire District. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kurt. Pleasure to be here.
So, it's kind of an introduction. Tell me a little bit about yourself, what got you into the fire service to begin with, and kind of where you ended up at.
Well, I started many years ago, 1976, in an Explorer program, similar to a Boy Scout program, but specific to the fire service. And as Paul Harvey would say, the rest is kind of history at that point. That was the passion that I've had, and have spent over 40 years now doing nothing but fire and EMS services. Started in Apache Junction, retired out of there, spent 8 years in Casa Grande as their assistant chief, and the last 7 years here in beautiful Pine Top, Arizona.
So with that, living down in the valley and the different kinds of topography, so it's interesting that now it seems like your passion has kind of switched to a little bit of Firewise and living in the forest and the urban wildland urban interface. Got to get those right. But yet you did have that wildland urban interface, just a little bit different down in the valley.
We did. So obviously Apache Junction was at the base of the Superstition Mountains, so we did have a wildland urban interface. Except in 1979, it wasn't called that. We didn't know those terms. But we had relationships with the local Forest Service. In fact, we had initial attack agreements, and our resources were much closer than the Forest Service's. So it was often that we were in the Tonto Forest putting out desert fires as a cooperator with the U.S. Forest Service and Division of Forestry and Fire Management. So when I came here, yeah, you're spot on. The beautiful pine trees, the diamond in the rough, quickly were a concern to me because it was a different fuel type. I unfortunately didn't get to do a lot of extended attack and see a lot of different fuel types. So all my wildland firefighting was in the Sonoran Desert. So coming up here, I quickly became a sponge and learned everything I could about this fuel type and the dangers that we as residents of the White Mountains are exposed to, especially being on the heels of catastrophic fires like Rodeo Chetaskai and the Wallow Fire. You know,
and I don't know if you were involved in either of those fires at all, but I think that's, especially with the Rodeo Chetaskai fire, that's where people kind of woke up and realized, because I know at one point you had to take a permit out just to cut a tree up here. And now it's kind of turned the opposite. You're building a house, and now you have to actually come into compliance with these Firewise guidelines to be able to get your certificate of occupancy. So it's changed. The culture is changing, yes. But there's still a learning curve, and I think people still have a misconception of, one, what is Firewise? I know when you typing it in on the computer, the computer automatically puts that red line underneath there because it's like doesn't recognize that word, and because it's something that's new, but yet it's not new because, like you mentioned, years ago you still had the same issues, and in fact it's interesting when the Wallow Fire kicked out. I was doing some research on that, and 100 years prior, there was actually a fire in that area, 100 years before the Wallow Fire, that was actually called the Bear Wallow Fire. And, and it shows the crew lined up that they took a picture back then, and there wasn't as many people as we put on fires these days.
So going back to your question about the Rodeo Chetaskai, that was a turning point, not just here in Arizona, but across forests nationally. I've done a little research on this, and we were one of the first community wildfire protection plans developed. There's several others that were going on, but that really was kind of the precipice of developing community wildfire protection plans across the country and getting communities engaged in this idea that wildfire is becoming a problem. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, the White Mountains is a desirable place for people to move. So more and more of us were moving into this idea of a WUI or wildland urban interface. So as we put more people into these areas that are adjacent to public lands, this problem has continued to grow. And whether you believe climate change or whatever the driver is, there is definitely something going on, particularly in the West, that is driving the catastrophic wildfires that we're experiencing and that we experienced here in Arizona. So that is, as you mentioned, a new concept for all of us is risk management. Risk management is not a new term for us as public safety providers, but looking at wildfire here in the White Mountains and trying to reduce that risk is definitely new for residents here, especially longtime residents.
Right, and like you say, there's lots of factors that have led into why fires get as big as they do, and whether they're allowed to control and mitigate forest fuels, or we're going out and we're being more proactive or more reactive and putting fires out quicker, but then eventually we're living in a big garden.
Yes. And
the stuff grows, and so you got to maintain that all the time. And so that's it. And I agree with you. That's because that's when I was getting involved with that kind of stuff. And I'd been on the fire department before, starting in the 90s. But that Rodeo Chetasky fire was a big, and now how do we educate the public? And when they first came out with the term of FireWise, they're using all these big terms and scientific terminology and things like basal area, and how do you explain that to the lay public? And even though they still use that science behind FireWise, I think they've made things a lot simpler in how to educate the public. And we have the Ready, Set, Go program and FireWise and that terminology. And one of the things that you've been very instrumental in helping all of our fire districts up here is getting that fire adapted communities. So what is it let's say we have a small subdivision, HOA, that wants to, they want to be more proactive and protect their little community. How do we go about getting them into the program and to be recognized?
Sure. Let me back up just a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a couple of principles. And one of those principles is that we cannot tackle this wildfire problem by ourselves. Not any one partner, any one entity. This really is, and this may be becoming an old term, it really does take a village to make a difference. And in that Community Wildfire Protection Plan, back in 2004, that first plan that was developed for us here in the White Mountains, thinning was a big part of that, or vegetation management. It helps us as firefighters be able to do what we need to do to protect those neighborhoods. The concept of FireWise is getting the property owners, and more importantly, if you've got an HOA where you can grasp a lot of property owners at one time, to be able to do kind of that quilt patchwork work within their community and building upon that, we then find that we now have an entire subdivision that is termed FireWise. Now, that has a lot of different meanings to it. It can mean that you've gone through and you've done vegetative management, meaning that you've taken the understory, the fuels, the ladder fuels, reduced those ladder fuels so that the fire can't creep up into our tall ponderosa pine forest or into the junipers as we get further west here in the White Mountains, to actually thinning the ponderosa pine. You talked about the basal area. While there is a technical term for us, there's a target goal for us as professionals. We look at 80 basal area. That's kind of the magical number to reduce crown fires. What we tell property owners is in that immediate zone or initial zone, we look at the 0 to 30 feet crown spacing of the treetops. So we try to get that spacing at least 12 feet at a minimum. But to get to your question specifically, the HOA simply has to reach out to us in the fire department and say this is an interest that they have. How do I become a FireWise community? And that doesn't mean that overnight, even though you're designated, that your community is protected. It didn't take us overnight to get here with a wildfire problem. It's not going to take us overnight to correct that wildfire problem. But those small steps, getting initiated, Maybe we come in, as you are aware, we actually come in and do a community assessment first. This gives us a risk rating for the community. Does the community have an exit plan? Does the community, in their CCNRs or covenants, do they have the ability to include things like hardening of the home? So if they have a new home that's coming into their community, can they include fire-resistant construction as an example? Because vegetative management alone isn't enough to guarantee that that home's going to survive a wildfire. It's a start, but it's not an absolute guarantee.
Right. There's many components on getting that, and it's a process to get recognized.
Yes.
But with that recognition, the more communities we have within our region, the easier it is to apply for those and receive those grants, which then turn around and help us give money to do those thinning projects and make a difference with the homeowners directly on, because it's not the easiest cost to come, be able to pay for that, to get that thinning done at your home. And then again, it's a process of maintaining it after that. I know we were talking earlier before this about, we live in that big garden and it keeps growing. And so you have to, just because you get to that status at one point doesn't mean you remain there. And it's, so, because currently we have quite a few little communities and subdivisions within our area.
Yes.
And the more we get, the better we are. And it's not that you have to, like you said, that you're currently considered fire-wise across the board, but you're working towards that.
Exactly, and it's a dynamic process. So in 2014, we didn't have any designated communities here in the White Mountains, which surprised me, considering we had two of the largest catastrophic wildfires in Arizona's history, certainly, and at the time in the country. So that was one of those focuses that we really, as you're aware, many of the fire districts took on, that we've got to get more of our communities engaged to help us address this problem. So today we have 13 communities that are now designated, and we have another 9 that are in various stages of being designated. And you're spot on. That doesn't mean you have to be 100% compliant today. It just means that every year you're making baby steps, increasing reducing that risk of wildfire in your community. And you mentioned the grants. We have been fortunate because of the amount of communities that have come on board, the community engagement, that we've been fortunate to get a number of those grants to help defray the cost. One thing I would like to add, though, is in our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, we've identified over 30,000 acres of property that needs to be treated here in the White Mountains, and those are private lands, not public lands. So that's a lot of work, and if you look at the amount of funding that we're getting annually to help a property owner defray that, it's going to take over 50 years for us to treat every acre that's been recognized as a high risk or extreme risk or moderate risk for wildfire. So we have got to get property owners to come on board and, quite frankly, in some cases, pony up a little bit of their own money or have some skin in the game to help us do this. And this may be them actually doing work with the lighter fuels that might be within their scope, and then having an expert or a contractor or fuels crew handle the heavier lifting, like bringing down ponderosa pines on their property.
Right, because there's some trees out there that we don't want just the ordinary person to try to fall, because they're going to cause some damage to themselves or get injured or killed.
Absolutely.
But you're right. And in fact, with our Ready, Set, Go program, they've adjusted those zones a little bit. It used to be Zone 1 was 0 to 30 feet out. Now they've actually identified just that 0 to 5 feet, which is really critical.
It is.
And I think we've both seen firsthand how important that first 0 to 5 feet is. And they're simple things. It's those ladder fuels. I know years ago, it was very popular to put juniper bushes as landscaping right up against the house. Yeah, they look kind of pretty. They're, trimmable, but I don't think people realized back then what a fire danger those really are. And now now getting people convinced to and educate them to remove those. Sometimes it's not so easy.
No, it's not, but you're exactly right. They're probably one of the most flammable types of vegetation that you can have, and when it's that close to the property within the 5 feet, as you mentioned, we've got study after study, post-analysis of many of these wildfires that have been examined, and that type of vegetation was a contributing factor to the loss of the home.
And it could be homes that are not even directly impacted from the flames itself. They're miles away because that ember cast.
That's
that
right.
ember cast can go for miles and burn homes down because they haven't taken that effort and cleaned up that first 0 to 5 feet. And it's not to say that we're saying remove all vegetation out of there. There are plants out there that are more fire resistive. And so just looking at what those are, our nurseries up here have been a great partner to work with in identifying what plants are okay to put in that space, or have nothing at all and use like rock or some kind of decorative landscaping, and then once you get outside that, now you can go with a little bit more, and then so that zone 2 is now 5 to 30 feet.
Yes.
And then everything else is beyond that. So and how do people get educated on, I know we have programs, but do people really know where to go and look for it?
So obviously, each of our respective fire districts have a fire prevention division, and that would be my first recommendation, is reach out to your local fire prevention division and ask about those resources. Annually, here in the White Mountains, we do a block party, and we're hoping this year, given our COVID environment, that we're going to be able to actually meet in person and provide some of those educational opportunities for folks in July. And again, we've had a little bit of a reprieve, but I think having that face-to-face contact with our community and educating them on just what the risk is. And I might add here that many folks, we're seeing a lot of new folks come into the community, and I think it's important for them to understand that if anybody was aware of the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, that fire devastated that community. They lost over 25,000 structures, and 86 people were killed in that fire, some of them in an evacuation process. But that community's risk on a scale of 1 to 5 was a 3.86. And depending on where you live here in the White Mountains, you're at a minimum of a 4.41 and as much as a 4.61. So we're on the higher end of that scale of 5. And I think folks need to understand that the only way, again, that we can do this is through vegetation management, hardening the home, understanding those treatment zones as you talked about, and helping us to get to those various zones and reducing that wildfire risk. The evacuation piece that you're well aware of, recently we did a tabletop exercise, and it was quite eye-opening for all of our partners that were present at that meeting. We learned a lot from what happened in Paradise, California, and those folks were prepared. They had a very well-designed evacuation plan. But when it came down to executing it, what we found was that the public hadn't been a big part of the testing of those processes. So I think one of the things that we pulled away from our evacuation tabletop exercise is that we need to work with the public and trying to train them on what this program is going to look like. So there will be more to come as we work on developing that draft plan as a result of that tabletop exercise that we just did last week.
And I know, having been in that meeting, and I kind of sat in the back and listened and more observed than anything, but it was interesting to see all the other partners in the room, and not only local, but other state partners as well. And I think there was a lot of people that it was an eye-opener for them, and comments that they had that were coming out from that was, oh, I didn't realize that, or who do I need to talk to, and when, if this were to happen, you know, especially the evacuation piece, you know, there's because if it's in the middle of a school day, you know, now what do you do?
Right.
Have you worked with your kids, your children enough that they know what to do if they're separated from you and now you can't make contact? Or we have a whole bunch of parents showing up at the school. Now we have congestion in the traffic, and that limits your ability to evacuate. We have a very small evacuation routes, very limited on how to get in. A lot of our communities, one way in, one way out, which is not a good thing.
Exactly.
Or maybe they have a back route, but they don't know where it's at.
Yes.
So getting that community involvement, I think, is really going to be very important. You know, watching when the Rodeo Chediskai fire and seeing that evacuation happen all at once, there were lines and lines and lines of cars for hours. What if you run out of gas in the middle of it?
Right.
So simple things.
Yep. And that's where that Ready, Set, Go guide comes into play, is that preparedness piece. You know, when you hear the ready message, what is your responsibility to preparing yourself as that wildfire progresses, and the different stages of the Ready, Set, Go program, which is what we use here in the White Mountains to alert folks to the various stages of evacuation.
Right, and I know when I advise people, of like, if you're in the predicament of you got issues with the smoke causing issues with your health, and you know, don't wait for the go ahead and leave, and leave early. That's okay. We're going to take,
Yes.
we got components in place to, you know, provide protection and with law enforcement, and, you know, so if we do evacuate whole neighborhoods or communities or the whole entire White Mountains, we have protection in place that people aren't going to be, you know, looking to rob your house and things like that. So it's a huge undertaking, and, you know, not easy for just one person or entity to take care of. It is a very much a statewide effort in some cases. So, you know, and even other things that are occurring outside, because, like, you know, you mentioned the 30,000 acres that need to be treated, which are on private lands. Well, how many acres outside of us? But we have Forest Service, BIA, state lands. They're doing their part. The 4Fry project.
Yes.
Has been very beneficial in getting, you know, property around us. And so when I talk to people, you know, I don't want to be the doom and gloom guy, but I'm more worried about a fire starting in town than I am starting out of town. We've got the area around our communities that's pretty well, you know, been addressed. And it's always an ongoing process, but the areas inside of town, we got some pull up Google Earth, and
yes.
where you got that real lifetime satellite imagery, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah, and I kind of brought this up that, you know, even with vegetation management, it's no guarantee. And one thing that I think often when we look at risk management, we prepare for the worst. We try to create that margin, so if there was anything that we couldn't see coming, that margin gives us the ability to say, whew, we didn't see that coming, but we've got this buffer planned in there that we were able to absorb that unknown, if you will. What folks have got to remember is that, you know, there's 1% to 2% of these wildfires that are out of our control, meaning they are pushed by the weather that's created by the wildfire. So, you know, vegetative management may help with the crown fire. We're still going to have ember cast. Ember cast is still going to create spot fires, as you mentioned, out ahead of that fire. It's still going to give us the ability, if we've got thinning, it reduces the amount, the rate of that spread of fires, so that we can at least begin to flank and start some ground cover attack, and maybe get into, even if it does get into the crowns, withdraw, do some attack, and then go back in and protect structures. But when we get those wind-driven events, the 1% to 2% of those fires, they're very tough to contain, even with the treatments that you mentioned on the public lands with the Forest Service or the BIA. That's still a potential. And even in those cases, you'll have ember cast fires. So in any of those situations, these are things that we're planning for, and how do we address them?
Right, and since we can adequately or accurately predict the winds up here, yeah, which it's and those wind, and it seems like lately the winds have even getting more and more drastic, and I know we've had a few structure fires that the wind has just been 30 plus with gusts greater than that, and we've gotten very fortunate that we didn't have as many spot fires as could have because of that. Now, moving further into the later in the year, things get more warm, drying out, and even we're already seeing in February we're seeing several roadside fires.
Yes.
That's not something that typically happens.
Yeah.
So it's been a very interesting year. I know we haven't had the snowpack, and we go through those drought seasons and wet seasons, and it seems like we've been kind of stuck in a little bit of a drought, and our snowpack's not where it normally is, but we still got to do our part to circumvent.
Yeah, our community can't be lulled into complacency because we've had these scattered storms. The accumulations have not been what we're accustomed to here in the White Mountains, and certainly over the last 20 years or 30 years, we've seen those accumulations reduce drastically. We are seeing some late season accumulation, but not what we're accustomed to. And in the West, Arizona in particular, the 2021 outlook is that we are in what's called a snow drought. So we're concerned, and they are predicting a significant wildfire season.
Well, I know we covered a whole lot of stuff.
Yes.
And our time is up, but I appreciate you being able to be on the show with us. And thank you once again for joining us on Safe and Sound. Join us for next month's edition.